A lot of the topics that we explore about artists basically have these tragic stories. Van Gogh, Modigliani, um, Caravaggio. They live these tormented, difficult, horrendous lives. But they're not all that way. And I don't want to perpetuate the myth that that is true for all artists, because it isn't. And Winslow Homer is an example of that. Winslow Homer had success in his lifetime. He did quite well. He had a fairly normal lifetime. And I use that in quotation marks because who only knows. But even so, his biography is fairly straightforward. And that's not true of Gauguin or Van Gogh or, again, of so many others. So initially I was like, gosh, is Homer going to be of interest to people? Yes, he's very, very, very relevant now. There's actually an upcoming exhibition at the Met in 2022, and they want to explore his interest in action and nature and race, and he was very much before his time in a lot of those themes. And so Winslow Homer. Um, this particular work was featured at the Pageant of the Masters in Laguna a few years ago. And just recently I saw that they drug this poster out again, so it was on display again. So it's one of Homer's most famous works. It captures the joy of childhood. Just a few weeks ago I saw some kids in the neighborhood playing Red Rover, where they're holding each other's hands and calling each other over, and then they run through each other's arms. Different than Snap the Whip, where they basically just spin and get dizzy and then, and then let go. But even so, some similarities, and it does have a sense of nostalgia. And it's a timeless quality. It's very much early America. And for that reason, I think his work is very nostalgic and very endearing to a lot of people. Here you have a limited palette. You have just a touch of blue, for instance, in the skies. It's mostly warm tones. And again, it just looks so earthy to us. We see kids bare feet in a schoolyard. Often a schoolyard would have one room, and it just has this certain charm to it. All the details are remarkable. So, 2015 again, Snap the Whip was the featured work, and so here is some examples of that. And what they do at Pageant of the Masters is they create a tableau and they actually pose the individuals to look like the painting. And with lighting and makeup, they create this living painting. If you've never gone, it's worth it. It really is a fascinating thing to see. And I try to make it there every year. And some years I miss it, but for the most part, I'm there. But even so, it is a really interesting experience as they are posing all of these famous paintings, not always famous, with real people. And it's quite the commitment for people to participate in it. So this is a tableau vivant. This again is they pose and they try not to move. Every once in a while you see one yawn or try not to sneeze or move their head a little bit. So it still has moments where you can detect that it's not real, but it's remarkable. I mean, some of them are very, very fascinating. This one, the palette, for instance, I think is a little bit off, but overall, I think they do an excellent job. So here we have a print of Snap the Whip. It was published in 1873. The importance of a print was that, first of all, it could be distributed, it could be printed in newspapers, it could basically be widely circulated. And so Snap the Whip was a successful work, and that the fact that it was printed would increase its popularity. So some backgrounds, I do like to include some biography of an artist. Now, sometimes you should just look at the work, but sometimes it's interesting to get a little bit of the background of the artist as well. So his early work was as a Civil War artist and printmaker, and he was working for Harper's, and he was doing illustration work. So, he did have a first-hand view of the war. Indeed, in one letter, his mother describes what we now know is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But again, it didn't have that label back then, but it was traumatizing for him. And early on, again, he worked independently. He did not like answering to a supervisor, so early on he decided, this is not for me. I'm going to be independent. I'm going to basically work for myself. And he did. Successful. His early work, again, captures the horror of the war. And this was one of the main ways that people were able to understand what was going on. So you have early photography that did document the Civil War to a point, but it wasn't perfect. And some of the most famous of the Civil War photographs are images of dead people on a battlefield, because they're not moving, and the very, very, very slow process of photography that made it easier so that you could actually see the figures come onto the image. But in any case, he ends up largely on the coast of Maine. His brother had bought a large parcel of coastland in Maine, and that becomes kind of a compound for the family. And so he did have a lovely home there, and ultimately he had developed a reputation for being extremely reclusive, but that's not entirely true. We do know that, for instance, there was a hotel that wasn't too very far away that would deliver meals to him, and he was very private, but not necessarily as reclusive as his reputation would have him be. Although he did have a sign that was on a gate that said that there were snakes and mice in this field, beware. So that's one way to keep people from coming to your door trying to sell you stuff. So his mother was an artist. Oftentimes these successful artists have an artist in the family that helps them get their training. For a lot of women artists, it was a male artist, a father, who was able to educate them, and basically that provides their art school, because women were not always allowed to go to art schools. So Henrietta Maria Benson Homer was his mother, and she exhibited at these floral prints, or these floral paintings, at the Brooklyn Art Association, and she was asking the relatively modest sum of $20 for the work. $20 in 1876 would have been a substantial number, actually. In the same show, her son Winslow Homer also exhibited work. Dismissed on a National Gallery website as amateur, the fact that a woman was able to even command prices such as that, I think that's a little dismissive. But here you could see that she did have, certainly did have some talent, and I think that was an important early influence on his skill, and gives him support to be an artist. So his father was a businessman and successful as well. So he was a person of means. He came from a family that had some means. And women artists that were doing watercolor were often described as amateur. Women were encouraged to do needlepoint, sewing, reading, but light reading, nothing intellectual, and painting certainly. Piano, it was good to be accomplished on an instrument, but there was very much a list of ladylike things that women should study. So I think that's one of the reasons why her work is kind of dismissed. It was, again, kind of a ladylike pursuit. So when he was 19, he was apprenticed to the lithographic firm of John Bufford in Boston. He did travel to Europe in the 1860s, and this would have certainly influenced him. I think you can see some of the influences of the Impressionist. Still, his style is, again, very much his own. Japonism becomes an influence as well. This work was produced in the 1860s. It was received very well. There were lots of casualties on both sides. And again, we've gleaned that from letters. But again, this was something that people had a lot of interest in. It was basically about current life events. This is a little larger so you can see the detail. And here we have Confederate soldiers surrendering to a Union soldier. Indeed, I got his name wrote down here. It is the Union Brigadier General Francis Barlow. And the Confederate soldiers look certainly a little more disreputable than the Union soldier, who again looks very, very clean and neat and professional. And Homer was pretty well documented. Homer was on the front lines at least 2 to 3 times. And at one point, he went without food for over 3 days with the rest of the troops that he was with, and that was in Yorktown. So it was a difficult time for him, and certainly a difficult time in history. So early on, he has success as an illustrator. Some of the images of the war he actually made into paintings. So he's very much an illustrator slash artist. I think so many times illustrators are not considered artists, but they are. The difference being illustrators generally get paid more, at least initially. So again, sometimes people are dismissive of illustration, and they shouldn't be, because certainly it requires a great deal of artistic skills. So these are his early works, 1860s, and he's working for, again, Harper's Weekly Illustrated, which was a big deal. It had a circulation of around 200,000 people, and that did not include like times when magazines would be in offices or pinned up in post offices. Some of his illustrations were printed as large as 12 by 16 inches. So these were important works and very much respected. And very much a way that people got their news. This was one of the main ways people got their news. It was an important time in the history of Harper's. So again, here we have another example of just the daily life of the Union officers. Home Sweet Home, 1863. This was extremely well received. It was just remarkable, and this is one of the examples of something that he actually made later into a painting. So you have images such as Army of the Potomac, a sharpshooter on picket duty, and he found a way to really personalize a lot of the images, to really have a sense of what their day to day was like. And so here he shows a solitary figure. He's showing new rifle technology and this ability to fire from a distance and remain unseen. This is from National Gallery. Here you can see again the details of this, which were remarkable. One of the reasons certain artists were chosen was for their ability to be able to sketch quickly and then add in details later, because they were on the front. It would be a pretty dramatic beginning for an artist, but it was something he also felt was also both an honor and a duty. After the war, he explored contemporary themes. This is Eagle Head, Manchester, Massachusetts. It's called High Tide. And this was a little bit shocking. You're probably going to be surprised to find out that this was a little shocking. This is 1870s. This is well before the 1900s. These women are showing their ankles. And it believe it or not, this would have been really, really, really edgy for its time period. I love the treatment of the water. I'm working on it on a side painting myself, but he was so skilled at it. I mean, all of the details are just so careful and remarkable. And I love the bathing wear of the women. Yes, these were their bathing suits. It's hard for us to imagine. It looks like it would be very, very difficult to swim in, but these were bathing costumes. So in the summers from 1868 to 1881, he often went to White Mountains, the Adirondacks, and Gloucester, Massachusetts. So here we have a self-portrait of the artist. He's the one that's closest to us. There's a satchel that actually says his name. If you look real carefully, I have a little zoomed in area on the corner here. And it's also a little bit tongue-in-cheek because we have three artists sitting in a row, basically painting the same view, and I think it's a little bit playful as well. So there's also a detail of a wine bottle on the stump on the edge of the painting. You can even see his little mustache just kind of off to the side of his face as well. In 1867, 1868, he travels to Paris and he stays there for a year. And I think he absorbed a lot of the styles of the European painters. But he also had a style all his own. So this is a detail of a Parisian ball and by Winslow Homer. And again, there's lots of activity in it. It's very, of course, the theme is reminiscent of someone like Toulouse-Lautrec. And he was actually talking about traveling to Washington and mentioned a comment that his editor made. He thinks I am smart and will do well if I meet no pretty girls down there, which he thinks I have a weakness for. Well, he was a young man. Of course he had a weakness for young girls. But he never married. He did have some women that he admired, however, and there is one that shows up in a number of his paintings. One of his close friends told biographer Lloyd Goodrich that the artist had the usual number of love affairs. He spent 10 months in France in 1866 to 67. Again, another source reported 1867, 68, and had an active social life there. So this is Helen Decay, who this was a young woman that he admired a great deal, and Portrait of a Lady, 1870s. But I think the women look similar, almost as if he might have used the same model and just changed the hair color. But maybe not. It's hard to determine. But there's certainly a similar type. A letter from Homer to Kay in 1872 indicates that something had come between them. He asked her to pick up a sketch he had made of her adding a few cryptic words of reassurance. I am very jolly. No more long faces. It is not all wrong. And so this is a woman he is believed to have had a relationship with. But for the most part, his life was pretty private. This has always been one of my favorites. Winslow Homer reading, or also called the new novel, and it's watercolor. He's also a master of watercolor. He could do etchings. He could do oil paintings. Certainly, he was an illustrator, but again, his skills as a watercolor artist are very, very strong. Here you have a limited palette. You have all these beautiful warm tones. And he doesn't worry about every single detail. And so here, again, I think you're seeing some of the influences of what he learned in France. Reading leisure activities were seen as unproductive tasks that were a waste of time for women whose minds should not wander, and they shouldn't have to worry about intellectual concerns. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. So there was that attitude that women should always have their hands busy sewing or embroidery or painting perhaps, making music, or taking care of their family. So this idea of laying down and reading, this was quite different. So this is Dad's Coming, 1873, also an early work. And I think this kind of shows the sort of themes he's going to have throughout most of his life. So early work were usually outdoors, oftentimes man against nature. Many were figure paintings. A lot of young boys show up in his works. There is, again, a nostalgia of childhood. Homer spent the summer of 1873 in Gloucester, and that's in Massachusetts, where he painted this family of fishermen awaiting his return. Young family. Here you compare to his late work. This is 1910. It is right before his death. It's not completely finished. You can see the foreground. There's no sense of movement to the water. So his brushwork tends to get looser and looser and more confident as time goes on. And I think that's typical of a lot of artists. So 1870s, 1910, 40 years separated. It doesn't even look like the same artist's work, really. Brushwork tightly controlled, and this is oil on wood, which is very traditional. Very formal, carefully organized, rather stiff, much more active. Again, it's unfinished, so you don't get to see what the foreground would have looked like. But lots of movements. The figures are not static at all, but it's also watercolor. The dinner horn, blowing the horn at Seaside, 1870. After the war, the palette gets lighter and certainly brighter. More happy, I'd like to say, certainly with time. And you can see a detail of the work right there. And it's showing rural life, again, just an everyday scene. And the brushwork is certainly a little bit freer in this than it was in the more stiff Dad's Coming work. Enchanted, 1870s. This is a charming image of first love. You have two young boys that are crushing on a young girl. It's darling and something I think most people can relate to. The red schoolhouse looks an awful lot like that schoolhouse in the back of Snap the Whip. So here we have the teacher shown the red schoolhouse. And so he remains a bachelor in his 74-year-old life. Again, was considered pretty private. And he hinted at the sentiment in 1908 note to a would-be biographer. I think it would probably kill me to have such a thing as my private life love affairs appear. And as the most interesting part of my life is no concern to the public, I must decline to give you particulars in regard to it. I have a puppy chewing a bone at my feet, and I apologize. This isn't perfect. Mawson and Swan camera that was owned by Winslow Homer. So he was influenced by photography, interest in cropping, perhaps in some of his paintings. And this would have also been a great tool for him to use. He could work from photographs. And so, again, there is that kind of photographic quality to his works. And so, telescopic close-up of the Union soldier perched in a tree and sharpshooter, and the boy sitting on a stone wall can't have been done from photographs, as he didn't purchase it until 1880s. So 1880s, after 1880s, it was a tool he could use. A canoe in the rapids, 1897. So we jumped quite a bit, and I've kind of moved to watercolors for now. Watercolor and graphite, off-white woven paper, Harvard Art Museums at the Fogg Museum. And this is a theme you're going to see a lot of, and I'm going to show you a number of them. Man against nature, young boy against nature, a coming of age. This is definitely a theme. And I think it's partly living in beautiful Maine as well. So, river scene, Florida. This is actually attributed to Winslow Homer. It's at the Clark Institute. Born shortly before Louis Daguerre announced his invention in 1839, Homer couldn't have avoided the pervasive influence of the metal plate daguerreotype and the paper photograph, happening during his lifetime. And so certainly I think he would have used some of these tools. And that would have been the benefit of a camera. I love using photographs. They're very helpful. And certainly they stay still. So if Winslow Homer nurtured a secret passion for photography, he hid his feelings well. There's no evidence, written or spoken, of the painter ever giving a public thought to the upstart technology. So this was an article basically discussing how much they thought that he used that camera. And again, we don't have a lot of information on that, so they don't think he used it a great deal, but I think he used it some. This is painted in Virginia, Carnival, 1870s. He showed people of color with a respect that was very unusual for a white male in this time period. Over and over and over again, we see this interest in people, period. And again, he treats them very, very respectfully. And again, captures this moment, captures this everyday scene, every detail. Here you can see it a little larger. And Carnival would have been an important time period. They didn't have a lot of leisure activities. They didn't have a lot to do. So carnivals, circuses, these would have been a big deal. Parades, just simply would have been something that would have been important in this day and time. After the hunt, Winslow Homer, again, you have here a hunting dog being pulled from the water, which is exactly where my a Labrador would be if I was in a boat. And then you, of course, see the deer that's right behind them as well. And so, again, these coming of age images. This is one of his most famous, and it is fantastic. I saw this at the LACMA. It was part of an exhibition at the LACMA a number of years ago. Don't ask me how long. I have no sense of time. And Gulfstream by Winslow Homer. The colors in this are amazing. This doesn't do it justice. Also has a little bit more green to it. But here you see the boat is vulnerable. He has no mast. He's strapped himself in. We see sharks around him. We see this turbulent ocean. And then there's just a speck of hope in the background. If you look, you can see a boat and you can see a water spout. And it's just an amazing, amazing image. But again, the star of the painting is not a white male, it's a black male. And again, I think it's an amazing picture. So, and it's not huge. When I saw it, I had thought, oh, it'll be massive. It's not huge, but I think it's larger than a lot of his works. Here's another example. This one doesn't have the sense of action that Gulfstream does, and this is a watercolor. Breezing up, a fair wind. Here you see some young males having a good time. It's a beautiful day on the water, just enough breeze to really enjoy themselves. I love the colors in the water, the deep greens, but this is, as the boat tells us, this is in Gloucester. So exhibited in 1876, this was the year of America's 100th celebration. Critics loved it, loved its freshness, its energy, and its great expectations for the future, the sense of it had a narrative or an allegory. So again, they sensed a larger meaning to it. The skipper's young American son gazing brightly off to the horizon is a symbol of our country's quiet valor, hearty cheer, and sublime ignorance of bad luck. So it's an image of innocence and hope. So he's sometimes labeled a marine painter, but I think that's a little limiting. And I don't think he is simply a marine painter. Um, this quote is on an article on Winslow Homer. If it's summer in New England, odds are there is a Winslow Homer show to see. And there are a lot of Winslow Homers to see, but again, there's a big one coming up at the Met. He's come to be associated with the rocky northern Atlantic coast that for many experience the landscape itself is incomplete without also experiencing his depictions. And then here we have the detail of Waiting for Dad or Dad's Coming. And again, these themes of young boys and boats over and over again. So the works are still hugely popular, very, very appealing. And this also is watercolor on wove paper. This is kind of different for him. Do you notice that this is a really, really muted palette? Maybe this is a kind of foggy morning. You know, it has an entirely different mood than a lot of the other works that I show you. And this also is watercolor. This is Blue Boat. There's also one called Red Boat. But the reflection on the water is beautiful. The details are remarkable. But there's also a softness that you definitely can see he's picking up from the Impressionist. He's not too worried about every single detail. Red Canoe. This is watercolor again. He does these broad swaths of watercolor. It really does make me kind of itch to want to try watercolor again, which is not my preference. It's very difficult to control. It's very loose. And I personally like acrylic, but acrylic wasn't something that would have been known to him. And then here we see a guide laying on the shore, and he has a canoe in front of him. He's taking a smoking break. This is in Houston, 1895. And so the provenance of this, the Glanville family acquired the watercolor from Kennedy Galleries in New York around the 1970s. And so the provenance is basically the history of a painting and where it has been. Very important. If you do a Google or Bing screenshot, it shows a lot of boats and canoes. This is tip of the iceberg. There's a great one of a bear, numerous canoes. I showed you some sailboats, some rowboats. 1890. I think this is probably my favorite Winslow Homer work. It's not very big, maybe like I don't know, like a large desktop computer or something like that. Not very big at all. And it's called Summer Nights. We have two women that are dancing on the beach. And so it is not realistic, although there is some realism to it. It does remind me a little bit of Gustave Courbet's work, his ocean scenes anyway, and symbolism. And this is at the Musée d'Orsay. So nocturnal scene, I think that appeals to me too. Again, it's at the beach. There is a sense of poetry, a mystery, sense of love, sense of friendship. And we don't know the relationship between the women. It could certainly be more. And I think that's interesting. You want to know the narrative, but you can't. It could be sisters for that matter. We don't know. And then you have a group of other people that are just shadowy to the side of them. So just the moonlight coming down, I don't know. I just think it's absolutely gorgeous work. So you can also compare it to realist artist Gustave Courbet, and he is working in the 19th century, mid-19th century. Young boys sitting on a fence, just in genre work again, everyday scene. You see a little cat to the side, and it's a charming work. And they're holding a cat too as well. So yet again, we see something on the water. We see young boys. We see a very much limited palette, a muted palette. It's all done in taupes and blues and light blue, a little dark blue in the back, grays, but very limited palette. Also watercolor. And this is dated 1893. You can read it in the corner. Fisherwoman, 1880s, oil on canvas. And he also remarkably painted all classes of people. All classes, different races. He just had an interest in people. Mending the Nets, 1882, a watercolor in gouache. Gouache is watercolor with some Chinese chalk in it to give it a little bit more body. It's not nearly so loose. Give me a choice of working with gouache or watercolor. Gouache is much easier, at least for me. And then here, again, contrast, a little bit looser brushwork in the second one. The young women, compared to the young men, tend to be involved in quiet activities, and that would have been representative of the time period. Along the domain of amateur painters, watercolors gained professional respectability in 1866 with the formation of the American Watercolor Society. Homer recognized their potential for profit. He could produce and sell them quickly. But he also liked the way watercolor allowed him to experiment. And again, before this time period, people were dismissive of watercolor. Again, it would have been something women would have dabbled in. Sick Chicken, 1874. I'm glad they had that title because I don't know if I would have seen that little tiny chicken unless I looked very, very closely. Almost looks like she might have a flower in her hand. But no, it's a chicken, or a chick, I should say. So watercolor, gouache, and graphite pencil on woven paper. So children in a schoolhouse, playing in the countryside, a young girl on a swing. Again, a real interest in uh, childhood. Here's another example. For those of you who love watercolor, you probably very much appreciate Winslow Homer. On the Trail, watercolor over graphite. The Fox Hunt, 1890s. Here you see these large birds. They're right over this fox. You have a sense that he's in danger as this flock of birds is coming towards him in this seascape. This is near the end of his life. A lot of experts have basically stated they think this is an allegory for the end of his life, that he feels the end is imminent. I don't know if I believe that. I think it might simply be a fox, and again, that interest in nature. But it could be, again, that's open to interpretation. I love the contrast, though, of the snow and the turbulent ocean in the background, and you see again the light on the water. It's really, really gorgeous. And then the really careful details of those berries. Something has just happened, or is about to happen, or will possibly happen, but often what and when are left unclear. Homer's The Fox Hunt, a flock of ravens besiege a fox struggling through deep snow, a seeming inversion of the food chain in a world where scarcity has caused extreme behavior. But the fox still might get away, so it does have some hope there. So, born 1836 to 1910, and born in Boston, again, a fairly comfortable, affluent family, and he dies in Prout's Neck in his studio. They believe he might have passed on this one bench that's in his studio. And I have some clips I will show you. And so by the 1890s, he's become generally recognized as one of the more important American painters. So he did have success in his lifetime, very much. His work brought top prizes, and his passing was briefly noted, and appreciation of his artistic achievement came more so after his death. But in his life, he did have some recognition as an artist, certainly more than a lot of the tragic stories that we get told in art history. This is called The Lifeline, and before I started studying for this lecture, um, I had never seen this. I thought this was fascinating. So here we have action, we have waves, we have movement, we have drama. And so this was very popular. It was very successful in his career. You have danger at sea, power of nature, and this heroic quality as well. And this is 1884. So he had observed in Atlantic City, New Jersey, these surfmen, these volunteers who responded to these storms and shipwrecks. and they often use this elaborate line system to rescue passengers and crew. And this was a line system that was new and innovative. So it was called the breeches buoy, devised by a forerunner of the U.S. Coast Guard. The breeches buoy, you can see them in action in the show in a Coast Guard video demo, is a cork preserver that attaches to the passenger's trousers. Shot by a powder cannon out into the ship in trouble, it saved many lives, especially women and children in the late 19th century. I just thought this was really interesting. And again, it's so dramatic. So uh, kind of wrapping around back to the beginning. This work has been treated by art historians over the past 50 years as unsettling, mysterious. One does not meet the expectations of a conventional seashore scene. Critics reacted in a similar way to the overt depiction of women in bathing costumes and undone hair. Uh, so Shocking in its time, but again, I'm kind of bringing us back around from the beginning. Here you can see it closer up. And so, again, he wanted to get back to a lighter sense, uh, and so he does in this beautiful seaside scene. 1890s, Santa Monica. Wool was often the fabric of choice for bathing. They might even wear hose. The painting is dated 1870. This is a detail of John Sloane's work. And here you can see 1910, Catalina Island. This is a family photograph of my husband's great-great-grandmother, which I salvaged after my husband's great-grandmother passed away. But in any case, I just love it because it's right in there. She's right in fashion. So Santa Monica more recently, we're wearing a lot less clothes in the water. Sometimes even you see them wearing hose with these woolen garments. One of these ladies is wearing actual hose. Weather beaten. I love this work as well. This work is gorgeous. Weather beaten, 1894, Portland Museum of Art. Portland Museum of Art in Maine. You're not going to see this in Portland, Oregon. Portland in Maine. And it's larger than many of his works. It's very dramatic. I've seen it when it's been on this coast being viewed, and it's absolutely stunning. All is lovely outside my house, inside my house, inside myself. This is a late quote from Winslow Homer. He had a stroke in 1908, and he dies 2 years later. This is paraphrased from the Met curators that are talking about their upcoming exhibition.